Today is a special day as we begin the Lenten season. And I thought there were some questions that people have given me over the years that I thought we would answer today and give you a chance to think about what we've talked about in the future. Why 40 days? Why is Lent 40 days? Well, the reality is the number 40 appears 146 times in the Bible. And it comes to a reality that in those 146 times, it basically says we are in a long time. We do know that when Jesus was getting prepared to do his ministry, he spent 40 days in the wilderness preparing himself, praying, and going through the process of getting himself ready for the ministry. And so we in the Christian tradition have followed with the 40 days that we too are going to have 40 days that we're going to prepare ourselves for whatever God has in store for us. Why are we going to use ashes today? Today is always a tough day for pastors wearing white albs because you really can make an ash of yourself quickly. The reality is we use ashes because it is an ancient symbol of penitence and mortality. As we read earlier, it's from the dust that we were created as human beings. And as we will say later on, there's going to be a time when the dust also will consume us again, at least our bodies. So it's a sign of humility and that life is temporary. The current bodies that we have are not going to last forever. The Spirit of God, however, is going to be with us in a way that allows us to live forever. But it won't be in these corruptible bodies, as Paul called them. And why communion? I was fortunate to go to a senior pastor conference a number of years ago, and one of the speakers was an Episcopal priest, and he had a call to worship that he used for communion every week, and I was so intrigued by it that afterwards I asked him if he'd be kind enough to send me a copy. And he agreed to do that. And he did. And I took it because I knew someday I want to preach on that. And today's the day. So, we're going to talk about communion today. And the meal is not for or of the church. It is Christ's meal. Notice it's called the Lord's Supper. It's not the Lakes Lutheran Supper. It's not the Lutheran Church Supper. It's not somebody else's supper. It's the Lord's Supper. Now, there are churches and denominations that have used communion as a weapon. And if people don't agree with their views or don't conform to what they want, they will withhold communion as if it was punishment. And that's the church thinking it's their supper. But it's not. It's the Lord's Supper. So it's a meal not of the church, but of Christ. And that Christ has invited all of us to receive that meal. And as we step forward to receive it later on today, we'll be inviting you to come forward to receive it. We're going to do this section first, and we'll all get taken care of. And then we're going to do this section next, and you're going to go this way, and we'll all be taken care of. But you're going to get bread, you're going to get wine, unless you choose to have the grape juice. But it is the Lord's Supper, and we must always keep that in mind, that it's not something owned by the church, but it's Christ's. It It's a meal that's ready for those who love Jesus. There are folks that have a very intimate relationship with Jesus. I think of one of the fellows that I met in seminary whose walk with the Lord was so tight and so impressive. He chose to live in South Minneapolis like a monk. He owned nothing. And he just went from house to house, school to school, neighborhood to neighborhood, doing the best he could to help those folks. He had an intimate relationship with Jesus, and I was very impressed with how he lived his life. Simple, dedicated, communicating with God on a very personal basis. Communion is for people like that. But communion is also for those who would like to know Jesus more. So we don't have to know Jesus well in order to receive communion. In one of my previous churches, I had the privilege of teaching at a Lutheran school, spent part of a summer teaching at a Lutheran school in Martin, Slovakia. And the church that we were working out of had been Lutheran since 1500s. Martin Luther was 1517. This church was Lutheran in 1530s. Beautiful building. But one of the women in the class that I was teaching had grown up in communist Slovakia. She knew very little about the Christian faith, and thus she was in this school. She came up to me one day after class and said, Mark, isn't it kind of barbaric to be eating flesh and drinking blood? I said, well, I understand the confusion. We as Lutherans practice what we call consubstantiation. The bread stays bread, the wine stays wine, but in the words spoken and the Spirit present, those elements become a sacrament. Jesus is present with us. So we're not really eating bread. We are eating bread that is representative of his body, but we're not really being cannibals. And so for her, it was a whole new enlightenment. She felt a little more comfortable with it. But what an honest question. She didn't know, had never been taught anything about Christianity in her elementary and high school and young adult years, having been under a communist regime. So it's ready for those who love Jesus and for those who would like to know Jesus more. The meal is ready for those with much faith. Peter, for example, when he was in the boat and the storm was raging and Jesus is walking on the water, everybody else is covering in the boat and afraid. What does Peter say? Jesus, if it's really you, let me walk to you. And Jesus said, come on down. If I got a deal for you. Peter's the only one that stepped out of the boat. Peter was the only one who had the courage to go away from his comfort zone and walk. And as long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, he stayed afloat. The minute he took his eyes off Jesus, he began to sink. Yes, communion is for those who have much faith, and I would have to say Peter is one of those who had much faith. But it's also ready for those of little faith. In Luke 19, we have the beautiful story of Zacchaeus, who was a tax collector. Everybody hated him. He was rich. And tax collecting in those days went like this. As tax collector, you could set the amount that you collected. You gave what you wanted to, what was required to give to the government, and you kept the rest. What a sweet deal. Now, even though Zacchaeus was vertically challenged, Menzies short, in case you missed that. But you heard Jesus was coming. He had no faith, but he climbed up in a tree because he wanted to get a look at this guy that's creating such a furor in his neighborhoods. And when Zacchaeus is up in that tree, what does Jesus do? He stops, sees this well-dressed man hanging out in a tree, and says, "You know what? I'm coming to your house for lunch." Jesus was no fool. He knew who to pick. But when he picked Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus invited him into his home. And what happened there is a man of no faith is so transformed by his experience with Jesus that afternoon that he said, "I will pay people back the money that I stole from them." Yes, when Jesus broke bread and drank wine at Zacchaeus' table, the man of no faith became a man of great faith and generosity. The meal is ready for those who come often. At this church, we practice communion every week, every service. I know of churches that practice communion every other week. Some do twice a month. I grew up in a church denomination that didn't do communion but quarterly. I know some churches don't do communion at all. But the reality is, no matter how often we come, it's ready for those who come often and those who are brand new, who've never had communion before. And that was always one of the fun things to do with First Communion classes, that you had kids who were sitting out there who had never had communion before, and to teach them what it means, to give them a chance to experience it before they would experience it in church. Communion is for those who follow Jesus. And Mary and Martha were faithful in following Jesus. In Luke 10, we have their story about how Jesus comes to their house to do some teaching, and the sisters get in a little bickering fight because one stops and pays attention to Jesus, and the other one's doing all the work of hospitality, which was required of women. And Jesus says, "You're both welcome." When their brother Lazarus dies, it's going to be Jesus who goes to the tomb and resurrects him. Yes, Jesus had a great relationship with Mary and Martha. But communion is also for those who fail. Judas, one of the followers of Jesus, he was the treasurer. But in John 12, we learn that he not only was a treasurer, but he also was an embezzler. And he would steal money out of the coffers from the disciples and Jesus to do his own thing. It's Judas who's going to turn Jesus into a profit-making machine for himself for 30 pieces of silver. It's Judas who's going to betray Jesus in the garden with a kiss. And guess what? Judas got his feet washed at the Last Supper, and Judas received communion there too. Jesus, knowing that he was going to be betrayed, said, "Go and do what you need to do." You see, communion is a place for those who have failed at faith as well. What I want you to take away from this Ash Wednesday is that you can come and Jesus invites you today. And no matter which category you were in as we went through them, you are welcome to receive communion. We are always welcome to come to the Lord's table, to the Lord's table. All are welcome. Always welcome. Thanks be to God. Amen.